1. For an event to have a cause and ground of its existence and yet not be connected with its cause is an inconsistence. For if the event be not connected with the cause, it is not dependent on the cause. Its existence as it were loose from its influence, and may attend it or may not, it being a mere contingence, whether it follows or attends the influence of the cause or not. And that is the same thing as not to be dependent on it. And to say the event is not dependent on its cause is absurd. It is the same thing as to say it is not its cause, nor the event the effect of it. For dependence on the influence of a cause is the very notion of an effect. If there be no such relation between one thing and another, consisting in the connection and dependence of one thing and the influence of another, then it is certain there is no such relation between them as is signified by the terms cause and effect. So far as an event is dependent on a cause and connected with it, so much causality is there in the case, and no more. The cause does or brings to pass no more in any event than is dependent on it. If we say the connection and dependence is not total but partial, and that the effect, though it has some connection and dependence, yet is not entirely dependent on it, that is the same thing as to say that not all that is in the event is an effect of that cause, but that only part of it arises from thence, and part some other way. 2. If there are some events which are not necessarily connected with their causes, then it will follow that there are some things which come to pass without any cause, contrary to the supposition. For if there be any event which was not necessarily connected with the influence of the cause under such circumstances, then it was contingent whether it would attend or follow the influence of the cause or no. It might have followed, and it might not, when the cause was the same, its influence the same, and under the same circumstances. And if so, why did it follow rather than not follow? Of this there is no cause or reason. Therefore here is something without any cause or reason why it is, vis-a-vis, the following of the effect on the influence of the cause, with which it was not necessarily connected. If there be no necessary connection of the effect on anything antecedent, then we may suppose that sometimes the event will follow the cause and sometimes not, when the cause is the same, and in every respect in the same state and circumstances. And what can be the cause and reason of this strange phenomenon, even this diversity, that in one instance the effect should follow, in another not? It is evident by the supposition that this is wholly without any cause or ground. Here is something in the present manner of the existence of things and state of the world that is absolutely without a cause, which is contrary to the supposition and contrary to what has been before demonstrated. 3. To suppose there are some events which have a cause and ground of their existence that yet are not necessarily connected with their cause is to suppose that they have a cause which is not their cause. Thus, if the effect be not necessarily connected with the cause, with its influence and influential circumstances, then, as I observed before, it is a thing possible and supposable that the cause may sometimes exert the same influence under the same circumstances, and yet the effect not follow. And if this actually happens in any instance, this instance is a proof, in fact, that the influence of the cause is not sufficient to produce the effect. For if it had been sufficient, it would have done it. And yet, by the supposition in another instance the same cause, with perfectly the same influence, and when all circumstances which have any influence are the same, it was followed with the effect. By which it is manifest that the effect in this last instance was not owing to the influence of the cause, but must come to pass some other way. For it was proved before that the influence of the cause was not sufficient to produce the effect, and if it was not sufficient to produce it, then the production of it could not be owing to that influence, but must be owing to something else, or owing to nothing. And if the effect be not owing to the influence of the cause, then it is not the cause. Which brings us to the contradiction of a cause and no cause, that which is the ground and reason of the existence of a thing, and at the same time is not the ground and reason of its existence. If the matter be not already so plain as to render any further reasoning upon it impertinent, I would say that which seems to be the cause in the supposed case can be no cause, its power and influence having, on a full trial, proved insufficient to produce such an effect. And if it be not sufficient to produce it, then it does not produce it. To say otherwise is to say there is power to do that which there is not power to do. If there be in a cause sufficient power exerted, and its circumstances sufficient to produce an effect, and so the effect be actually produced at one time, all these things concurring will produce the effect at all times. And so we may turn it the other way. That which proves not sufficient at one time cannot be sufficient at another, with precisely the same influential circumstances. And therefore, if the effect follows, it is not owing to that cause, unless the different time be a circumstance which has influence, but that is contrary to the supposition. For it is supposed that all circumstances that have influence are the same. And besides, this would be to suppose the time to be the cause, which is contrary to the supposition of the other thing being the cause. But if merely diversity of time has no influence, then it is evident that it is as much of an absurdity to say the cause was sufficient to produce the effect at one time and not at another, as to say that it is sufficient to produce the effect at a certain time and yet not sufficient to produce the same effect at the same time. On the whole, it is clearly manifest that every effect has a necessary connection with its cause, or with that which is the true ground and reason of its existence, and therefore, if there be no event without a cause, as was proved before, then no event whatsoever is contingent in the manner that Arminians suppose the free acts of the will to be contingent. Concerning the notion of liberty of will consisting in indifference. What has been said in the foregone section has a tendency in some measure to evince the absurdity of the opinion of such as placed liberty in indifference, or in that equilibrium whereby the will is without all antecedent bias, that the determination of the will to either side may be entirely from itself, and that it may be owing only to its own power, and the sovereignty which it has over itself, that it goes this way rather than that. But inasmuch as this has been of such long standing and has been so generally received, and so much insisted on by Pelagians, semi-Pelagians, Jesuits, Socinians, Arminians, and others, it may deserve a more full consideration. And therefore I shall now proceed to a more particular and thorough inquiry into this notion. Now, lest some should suppose that I do not understand those that place liberty in indifference, or should charge me with misrepresenting their opinion, I would signify that I am sensible there are some who, when they talk of liberty of the will as consisting in indifference, express themselves as though they would not be understood to mean the indifference of the inclination or tendency of the will, but an indifference of the soul's power of willing, or that the will, with respect to its power or ability to choose, is indifferent, can go either way indifferently, either to the right hand or left, either act or forbear to act, one as well as the other. This indeed seems to be a refining of some particular writers only, and newly invented, which will by no means consist with the manner of expression used by the defenders of liberty of indifference in general. I wish such refiners would thoroughly consider whether they distinctly know their own meaning, when they make a distinction between an indifference of the soul as to its power or ability of choosing, and the soul's indifference as to the preference or choice itself, and whether they do not deceive themselves in imagining that they have any distinct meaning at all. The indifference of the soul as to its ability or power to will must be the same thing as the indifference of the state of the power or faculty of the will, or the indifference of the state which the soul itself, which has that power or faculty, hitherto remains in, as to the exercise of that power in the choice it shall by and by make. But not to insist any longer on the inexplicable abstruseness of this distinction, let what will be supposed concerning the meaning of them that use it, this much must at least be intended by Arminians when they talk of indifference as essential to liberty of will, if they intend anything in any respect to their purpose, vis-a-vis, that it is such an indifference as leaves the will not determined already, but free from actual possession, and vacant of predetermination so far that there may be room for the exercise of the self-determining power of the will, and that the will's freedom consists in or depends upon this vacancy and opportunity that is left for the will itself to be the determiner of the act that is to be the free act. And here I would observe in the first place that to make out this scheme of liberty, the indifference must be perfect and absolute, there must be a perfect freedom from all antecedent preponderation or inclination, because if the will be already inclined before it exerts its own sovereign power on itself, then its inclination is not wholly owing to itself. If when two opposites are proposed to the soul for its choice, the proposal does not find the soul wholly in a state of indifference, then it is not found in a state of liberty for mere self-determination. The least degree of an antecedent bias must be inconsistent with their notion of liberty, for so long as prior inclination possesses the will and is not removed, the former binds the latter, so that it is utterly impossible that the will should act otherwise than agreeably to it. Surely the will cannot act or choose contrary to a remaining prevailing inclination of the will. To suppose otherwise would be the same thing as to suppose that the will is inclined contrary to its present prevailing inclination, or contrary to what it is inclined to. That which the will prefers, to that, all things considered, it preponderates and inclines. It is equally impossible for the will to choose contrary to its own remaining and present preponderating inclination, as it is to prefer contrary to its own present preference, or choose contrary to its own present choice. The will, therefore, so long as it is under the influence of an old preponderating inclination, is not at liberty for a new free act, or any that shall now be an act of self-determination. That which is a self-determined free act must be one which the will determines in the possession and use of a peculiar sort of liberty, such as consists in a freedom from everything which, if it were there, would make it impossible that the will at that time should be otherwise than that way to which it tends. If any one should say there is no need that the indifference should be perfect, but although a former inclination still remains, yet, if it be not very strong, possibly the strength of the will may oppose and overcome it. This is grossly absurd, for the strength of the will, let it be never so great, gives it no such sovereignty and command as to cause itself to prefer and not to prefer at the same time, or to choose contrary to its own present choice. Therefore, if there be the least degree of antecedent preponderation of the will, it must be perfectly abolished before the will can be at liberty to determine itself the contrary way. And if the will determines itself the same way, it was not a free determination, because the will is not wholly at liberty in so doing. Its determination is not altogether from itself, but it was partly determined before in its prior inclination. And all the freedom the will exercises in the case is in an increase of inclination which it gives itself, added to what it had by a foregoing bias. So much is from itself, and so much is from perfect indifference. For though the will had a previous tendency that way, yet as to that additional degree of inclination it had no tendency. Therefore the previous tendency is of no consideration with respect to the act wherein the will is free, so that it comes to the same thing which was said at first, that as to the act of the will wherein the will is free, there must be perfect indifference or equilibrium. To illustrate this, suppose a sovereign self-moving power in a natural body, but that the body is in motion already by an antecedent bias, for instance, gravitation towards the center of the earth, and has one degree of motion by virtue of that previous tendency. But by its self-moving power it adds 1 degree more to its motion, and moves so much more swiftly towards the center of the earth than it would do by its gravity only. It is evident all that is owing to a self-moving power in this case is the additional degree of motion, and that the other degree which it had from gravity is of no consideration in the case. The effect is just the same, as if the body had received from itself 1 degree of motion from a state of perfect rest. So, if we suppose a self-moving power given to the scale of a balance, which has a weight of 1 degree beyond the opposite scale, and if we ascribe to it an ability to add to itself another degree of force the same way, by its self-moving power, this is just the same thing as to ascribe to it a power to give itself 1 degree of preponderation from a perfect equilibrium, and so much power as the scale has to give itself an overbalance from a perfect equipoise, so much self-moving, self-preponderating power it has, and no more, so that its free power this way is always to be measured from perfect equilibrium. I need say no more to prove that if indifference be essential to liberty, it must be perfect indifference, and that so far as the will is destitute of this, so far is it destitute of that freedom by which it is in a capacity of being its own determiner, without being at all passive or subject to the power and sway of something else in its motions and determinations. Having observed these things, let us now try whether this notion of the liberty of will consisting in indifference and equilibrium, and the will's self-determination in such a state, be not absurd and inconsistent. And here I would lay down this as an axiom of undoubted truth, that every free act is done in a state of freedom, and not only after such a state. If an act of the will be an act wherein the soul is free, it must be exerted in a state of freedom, and in the time of freedom. It will not suffice that the act immediately follows a state of liberty, but liberty must yet continue and coexist with the act, the soul remaining in possession of liberty. Because that is the notion of a free act of the soul, even an act wherein the soul uses or exercises liberty. But if the soul is not, in the very time of the act, in possession of liberty, it cannot at that time be in the use of it. Now the question is, whether ever the soul of man puts forth an act of will while it yet remains in a state of liberty, vis-a-vis as implying a state of indifference, or whether the soul ever exerts an act of preference while at that very time the will is in a perfect equilibrium, not inclining one way more than another. The very putting of the question is sufficient to show the absurdity of the affirmative answer. For how ridiculous would it be for anybody to insist that the soul chooses one thing before another when at the very same instant it is perfectly indifferent with respect to each? This is the same thing as to say the soul prefers one thing to another at the very same time that it has no preference. Choice and preference can no more be in a state of indifference than motion can be in a state of rest, or than the preponderation of the scale of a balance can be in a state of equilibrium. Motion may be the next moment after rest, but cannot coexist with it in any, even the least part of it. So choice may be immediately after a state of indifference, but cannot coexist with it. Even the very beginning of it is not in a state of indifference, and therefore, if this be liberty, no act of the will in any degree is ever performed in a state of liberty or in the time of liberty. Volition and liberty are so far from agreeing together and being essential one to another that they are contrary one to another, and one excludes and destroys the other as much as motion and rest, light and darkness, or life and death. So that the will acts not at all, does not so much as begin to act in the time of such liberty. Freedom has ceased to be at the first moment of action, and therefore liberty cannot reach the action to affect or qualify it or give it a denomination any more than if it had ceased to be 20 years before the action began. The moment that liberty ceases to be, it ceases to be a qualification of anything. If light and darkness succeed one another instantaneously, light qualifies nothing after it is gone out to make anything lightsome or bright at the first moment of perfect darkness, any more than months or years after. Life denominates nothing vital at the first moment of perfect death. So freedom, if it consists in or implies indifference, can denominate nothing free at the first moment of preference or preponderation. Therefore it is manifest that no liberty which the soul is possessed of or ever uses in any of its acts of volition consists in indifference, and that the opinion of such as suppose that indifference belongs to the very essence of liberty is to the highest degree absurd and contradictory. If anyone should imagine that this manner of arguing is nothing but a trick and delusion, and to evade the reasoning should say that the thing wherein the will exercises its liberty is not in the act of choice or preponderation itself, but in determining itself to a certain choice or preference, that the act of the will wherein it is free and uses its own sovereignty consists in its causing or determining the change or transition from a state of indifference to a certain preference, or determining to give a certain turn to the balance, which has hitherto been even, and that the will exerts this act in a state of liberty, or while the will yet remains in equilibrium and perfect master of itself, I say if anyone chooses to express his notion of liberty after this, or some such manner, let us see if he can succeed any better than before. What is asserted is that the will, while it yet remains in perfect equilibrium without preference, determines to change itself from that state and excite in itself a certain choice or preference. Now let us see whether this does not come to the same absurdity we had before. If it be so that the will, while it yet remains perfectly indifferent, determines to put itself out of that state and to give itself a certain preponderation, then I would inquire whether the soul does not determine this of choice, or whether the will coming to a determination to do so be not the same thing as the soul coming to a choice to do so. If the soul does not determine this of choice or in the exercise of choice, then it does not determine it voluntarily. And if the soul does not determine it voluntarily or of its own will, then in what sense does its will determine it? And if the will does not determine it, then how is the liberty of the will exercised in the determination? What sort of liberty is exercised by the soul in those determinations wherein there is no exercise of choice, which are not voluntary, and wherein the will is not concerned? But if it be allowed that this determination is an act of choice, and it be insisted on that the soul, while it yet remains in a state of perfect indifference, chooses to put itself out of that state, and to turn itself one way, then the soul is already come to a choice and chooses that way. And so we have the very same absurdity which we had before. Here is the soul in a state of choice and in a state of equilibrium both at the same time, the soul already choosing one way while it remains in a state of perfect indifference and has no choice of one way more than the other. And indeed, this manner of talking, though it may a little hide the absurdity, in the obscurity of expression, increases the inconsistence. To say the free act of the will or the act which the will exerts in a state of freedom and indifference does not imply preference in it, but is what the will does in order to cause or produce a preference, is as much as to say the soul chooses, for to will and to choose are the same thing, without choice, and prefers without preference, in order to cause or produce the beginning of a preference or the first choice. And that is, that the first choice is exerted without choice, in order to produce itself. If any, to evade these things, should own that a state of liberty and a state of indifference are not the same, and that the former may be without the latter, but should say that indifference is still essential to freedom, as it is necessary to go immediately before it, it being essential to the freedom of an act of will that it should directly and immediately arise out of a state of indifference, still this will not help the cause of Arminian liberty, or make it consistent with itself. For if the act springs immediately out of a state of indifference, then it does not arise from antecedent choice or preference. But if the act arises directly out of a state of indifference without any intervening choice to determine it, then the act not being determined by choice is not determined by the will. The mind exercises no free choice in the affair, and free choice and free will have no hand in the determination of the act, which is entirely inconsistent with their notion of the freedom of volition. If any should suppose that these absurdities may be avoided by saying that the liberty of the mind consists in a power to suspend the act of the will, and so to keep it in a state of indifference until there has been opportunity for consideration, and so shall say that, however, indifference is not essential to liberty in such a manner that the mind must make its choice in a state of indifference, which is in an inconsistency, or that the act of will must spring immediately out of indifference, yet indifference may be essential to the liberty of acts of the will in this respect, viz., that liberty consists in a power of the mind to forbear or suspend the act of volition, and keep the mind in a state of indifference for the present, until there has been opportunity for proper deliberation. I say, if anyone imagines that this helps the matter, it is a great mistake. It reconciles no inconsistency and relieves no difficulty, for here the following things must be observed. 1. That this suspending of volition, if there be properly any such thing, is itself an act of volition. If the mind determines to suspend its act, it determines it voluntarily. It chooses, on some consideration, to suspend it. And this choice or determination is an act of the will, and indeed it is supposed to be so in the very hypothesis, for it is supposed that the liberty of the will consists in its power to do this, and that its doing it is the very thing wherein the will exercises its liberty. But how can the will exercise liberty in it if it be not an act of the will? The liberty of the will is not exercised in anything but what the will does. 2. This determining to suspend acting is not only an act of the will, but it is supposed to be the only free act of the will, because it is said that this is the thing wherein the liberty of the will consists. If so, then this is all the act of the will that we have to consider in this controversy. And now the former question returns upon us, vis-a-vis, wherein consists the freedom of the will in those acts wherein it is free? And if this act of determining a suspension be the only act in which the will is free, then wherein consists the will's freedom with respect to this act of suspension? And how is indifference essential to this act? The answer must be, according to what is supposed in the evasion under consideration, that the liberty of the will in this act of suspension consists in a power to suspend even this act, until there has been opportunity for thorough deliberation. But this will be to plunge directly into the grossest nonsense, for it is the act of suspension itself that we are speaking of, and there is no room for a space of deliberation and suspension in order to determine whether we will suspend or no, for that supposes that even suspension itself may be deferred, which is absurd. For the very deferring the determination of suspension to consider whether we will suspend or no will be actually suspending. For during the space of suspension, to consider whether to suspend, the act is ipso facto suspended. There is no medium between suspending to act and immediately acting, and therefore no possibility of avoiding either the one or the other one moment. And besides, this is attended with ridiculous absurdity another way, for now, it seems, liberty consists wholly in the mind having power to suspend its determination whether to suspend or no, that there may be time for consideration whether it be best to suspend. And if liberty consists in this only, then this is the liberty under consideration. We have to inquire now how liberty, with respect to this act of suspending a determination of suspension, consists in indifference, or how indifference is essential to it. The answer, according to the hypothesis we are upon, must be that it consists in a power of suspending even this last mentioned act, to have time to consider whether to suspend that. And then the same difficulties and inquiries return over again with respect to that, and so on forever, which, if it would show anything, would show only that there is no such thing as a free act. It drives the exercise of freedom back in infinitum, and that is to drive it out of the world. And besides all this, there is a delusion and a latent gross contradiction in the affair another way, inasmuch as in explaining how, or in what respect, the will is free with regard to a particular act of volition, it is said that its liberty consists in a power to determine to suspend that act, which places liberty not in that act of volition which the inquiry is about, but altogether in another antecedent act, which contradicts the thing supposed in both the question and answer. The question is, wherein consists the mind's liberty in any particular act of volition? And the answer, in pretending to show wherein lies the mind's liberty in that act, in effect says, it does not lie in that act at all, but in another, vis-a-vis a volition to suspend that act, and therefore the answer is both contradictory and altogether impertinent and beside the purpose, for it does not show wherein the liberty of the will consists in the act in question. Instead of that, it supposes it does not consist in that act at all, but in another distinct from it, even a volition to suspend that act and take time to consider of it. And no account is pretended to be given wherein the mind is free with respect to that act, wherein this answer supposes the liberty of the mind indeed consists, vis-a-vis the act of suspension or of determining the suspension. On the whole, it is exceeding manifest that the liberty of the mind does not consist in indifference, and that indifference is not essential or necessary to it, or at all belonging to it, as the Arminians suppose, that opinion being full of nothing but self-contradiction. Of the connection of the acts of the will with the dictates of the understanding. It is manifest that no acts of the will are contingent in such a sense as to be without all necessity, or so as not to be necessary with a necessity of consequence and connection, because every act of the will is some way connected with the understanding, and is as the greatest apparent good is, in the manner which has already been explained, namely, that the soul always wills or chooses that which, in the present view of the mind, considered in the whole of that view, and all that belongs to it, appears most agreeable. Because, as was observed before, nothing is more evident than that, when men act voluntarily and do what they please, then they do what appears most agreeable to them, and to say otherwise would be as much as to affirm that men do not choose what appears to suit them best, or what seems most pleasing to them, or that they do not choose what they prefer, which brings the matter to a contradiction. And as it is very evident in itself that the acts of the will have some connection with the dictates or views of the understanding, so this is allowed by some of the chief of the Arminian writers, particularly by Dr. Whitby and Dr. Samuel Clarke. Dr. Turnbull, though a great enemy to the doctrine of necessity, allows the same thing. In his Christian Philosophy, page 196, he, with much approbation, cites another philosopher as of the same mind, in these words: "No man, says an excellent philosopher, sets himself about anything but upon some view or other which serves him for a reason for what he does, and whatsoever faculties he employs, the understanding, with such light as it has, well or ill formed, constantly leads, and by that light, true or false, all her operative powers are directed. The will itself, how absolute and incontrollable soever it may be thought, never fails in its obedience to the dictates of the understanding. Temples have their sacred images, and we see what influence they have always had over a great part of mankind. But in truth, the ideas and images in men's minds are the invisible powers that constantly govern them, and to these they all pay universally a ready submission. But whether this be in a just consistence with themselves and their own notions of liberty, I desire may now be impartially considered. Dr. Whitby plainly supposes that the acts and determinations of the will always follow the understanding's view of the greatest good to be obtained, or evil to be avoided, or, in other words, that the determinations of the will constantly and infallibly follow these two things in the understanding: 1. The degree of good to be obtained, and evil to be avoided, proposed to the understanding, and apprehended, viewed, and taken notice of by it. 2. The degree of the understanding's apprehension of that good or evil which is increased by attention and consideration. That this is an opinion in which he is exceeding peremptory, as he is in every opinion which he maintains in his controversy with the Calvinists, with disdain of the contrary opinion as absurd and self-contradictory, will appear by the following words in his discourse on the 5 points. Now, it is certain that what naturally makes the understanding to perceive is evidence proposed and apprehended, considered or adverted to, for nothing else can be requisite to make us come to the knowledge of the truth. Again, what makes the will choose is something approved by the understanding, and consequently appearing to the soul as good. And whatsoever it refuseth is something represented by the understanding, and so appearing to the will as evil. Whence all that God requires of us is and can be only this, to refuse the evil and choose the good. Wherefore, to say that evidence proposed, apprehended, and considered is not sufficient to make the understanding approve, or that the greatest good proposed, the greatest evil threatened, when equally believed and reflected on, is not sufficient to engage the will to choose the good and refuse the evil, is in effect to say, that which alone doth move the will to choose or to refuse, is not sufficient to engage it so to do, which, being contradictory to itself, must of necessity be false. Be it then so that we naturally have an aversion to the truths proposed to us in the gospel, that only can make us indisposed to attend to them, but cannot hinder our conviction when we do apprehend them and attend to them. Be it that there is in us also a renitency to the good we are to choose, that only can indispose us to believe it is, and to approve it as our chiefest good. Be it that we are prone to the evil that we should decline, that only can render it the more difficult for us to believe it is the worst of evils. But yet, what we do really believe to be our chiefest good will still be chosen, and what we apprehend to be the worst of evils will, whilst we do continue under that conviction, be refused by us. It therefore can be only requisite, in order to these ends, that the good Spirit should so illuminate our understandings that we, attending to and considering what lies before us, should apprehend and be convinced of our duty, and that the blessings of the gospel should be so propounded to us, as that we may discern them to be our chiefest good, and the miseries it threateneth, so as we may be convinced that they are the worst of evils, that we may choose the one and refuse the other. Here let it be observed how plainly and peremptorily it is asserted that the greatest good proposed and the greatest evil threatened, when equally believed and reflected on, is sufficient to engage the will to choose the good and refuse the evil, and is that alone which doth move the will to choose or to refuse, and that it is contradictory to itself to suppose otherwise, and therefore must of necessity be false, and then what we do really believe to be our chiefest good will still be chosen, and what we apprehend to be the worst of evils will, whilst we continue under that conviction, be refused by us. Nothing could have been said more to the purpose fully to signify that the determinations of the will must evermore follow the illumination, conviction, and notice of the understanding with regard to the greatest good and evil proposed, reckoning both the degree of good and evil understood, and the degree of understanding, notice, and conviction of that proposed good and evil, and that it is thus necessarily, and can be otherwise in no instance, because it is asserted that it implies a contradiction to suppose it ever to be otherwise. I am sensible the doctor's aim in these assertions is against the Calvinist, to show, in opposition to them, that there is no need of any physical operation of the Spirit of God on the will to change and determine that to a good choice, but that God's operation and assistance is only moral, suggesting ideas to the understanding, which he supposes to be enough if those ideas are attended to infallibly to obtain the end. But whatever his design was, nothing can more directly and fully prove that every determination of the will in choosing and refusing is necessary, directly contrary to his own notion of the liberty of the will. For if the determination of the will evermore in this manner follows the light, conviction, and view of the understanding concerning the greatest good and evil, and this be that alone which moves the will, and it be a contradiction to suppose otherwise, then it is necessarily so, the will necessarily follows this light or view of the understanding, not only in some of its acts, but in every act of choosing and refusing, so that the will does not determine itself in any one of its own acts, but every act of choice and refusal depends on, and is necessarily connected with, some antecedent cause, which cause is not the will itself, nor any act of its own, nor anything pertaining to that faculty, but something belonging to another faculty whose acts go before the will in all its acts and govern and determine them. Here, if it should be replied that although it be true that according to the doctor the final determination of the will always depends upon, and is infallibly connected with, the understanding's conviction and notice of the greatest good, yet the acts of the will are not necessary, because that conviction of the understanding is first dependent on a preceding act of the will in determining to take notice of the evidence exhibited, by which means the mind obtains that degree of conviction which is sufficient and effectual to determine the consequent and ultimate choice of the will, and that the will, with regard to that preceding act, whereby it determines whether to attend or no, is not necessary, and that in this the liberty of the will consists, that when God holds forth sufficient objective light, the will is at liberty whether to command the attention of the mind to it or not. Nothing can be more weak and inconsiderate than such a reply as this, for that preceding act of the will in determining to attend and consider still is an act of the will, if the liberty of the will consists in it, as is supposed, as if it be an act of the will, it is an act of choice or refusal, and therefore if what the doctor asserts be true, it is determined by some antecedent light in the understanding concerning the greatest apparent good or evil. For he asserts it is that light which alone doth move the will to choose or refuse, and therefore the will must be moved by that, in choosing to attend to the objective light offered, in order to another consequent act of choice, so that this act is no less necessary than the other. And if we suppose another act of the will, still preceding both these mentioned, to determine both, still that also must be an act of the will, an act of choice, and so must, by the same principles, be infallibly determined by some degree of light in the understanding concerning the greatest good. And let us suppose as many acts of the will, one preceding another, as we please, yet are they every one of them necessarily determined by a certain degree of light in the understanding, concerning the greatest and most eligible good in that case, and so not one of them free according to Dr. Whitby's notion of freedom. And if it be said, the reason why men do not attend to light held forth is because of ill habits contracted by evil acts committed before, whereby their minds are indisposed to consider the truth held forth to them, the difficulty is not at all avoided. Still the question returns, what determined the will in those preceding evil acts? It must, by Dr. Whitby's principles, still be the view of the understanding concerning the greatest good and evil. If this view of the understanding be that alone which doth move the will to choose or refuse, as the doctor asserts, then every act of choice or refusal from a man's first existence is moved and determined by this view, and this view of the understanding exciting and governing the act must be before the act, and therefore the will is necessarily determined in every one of its acts from a man's first existence, by a cause beside the will, and a cause that does not proceed from or depend on any act of the will at all, which at once utterly abolishes the doctor's whole scheme of liberty of will, and he at one stroke has cut the sinews of all his arguments from the goodness, righteousness, faithfulness, and sincerity of God, in his commands, promises, threatenings, calls, invitations, and expostulations, which he makes use of under the heads of reprobation, election, universal redemption, sufficient and effectual grace, and the freedom of the will of man, and has made vain all his exclamations against the doctrine of the Calvinists, as charging God with manifest unrighteousness, unfaithfulness, hypocrisy, fallaciousness, and cruelty. Dr. Samuel Clarke, in his demonstration of the being and attributes of God, to evade the argument to prove the necessity of volition from its necessary connection with the last dictate of the understanding, supposes the latter not to be diverse from the act of the will itself. But if it be so, it will not alter the case as to the necessity of the act. If the dictate of the understanding be the very same with the determination of the will, as Dr. Clarke supposes, then this determination is no fruit or effect of choice, and if so, no liberty of choice has any hand in it. It is necessary, that is, choice cannot prevent it. If the last dictate of the understanding be the same with the determination of volition itself, then the existence of that determination must be necessary as to volition. Inasmuch as volition can have no opportunity to determine whether it shall exist or no, it having existence already before volition has opportunity to determine anything. It is itself the very rise and existence of volition. But a thing after it exists has no opportunity to determine as to its own existence. It is too late for that. If liberty consists in that which Arminians suppose, vis-a-vis, in the will determining its own acts having free opportunity and being without all necessity, this is the same as to say that liberty consists in the soul having power and opportunity to have what determinations of the will it pleases. And if the determinations of the will and the last dictates of the understanding be the same thing, then liberty consists in the mind having power and opportunity to choose its own dictates of understanding. But this is absurd, for it is to make the determination of choice prior to the dictate of understanding and the ground of it, which cannot consist with the dictate of the understanding being the determination of choice itself. Here is no alternative but to recur to the old absurdity of one determination before another, and the cause of it, and another before, determining that, and so on in infinitum. If the last dictate of the understanding be the determination of the will itself, and the soul be free with regard to that dictate, in the Arminian notion of freedom, then the soul, before that dictate of its understanding exists, voluntarily and according to its own choice determines, in every case, what that dictate of the understanding shall be. Otherwise that dictate, as to the will, is necessary, and the acts determined by it must also be necessary, so that there is a determination of the mind prior to that dictate of the understanding, an act of choice going before it, choosing and determining what that dictate of the understanding shall be, and this preceding act of choice, being a free act of will, must also be the same with another last dictate of the understanding, and if the mind also be free in that dictate of understanding, that must be determined still by another, and so on forever. Besides, if the dictate of the understanding and determination of the will be the same, this confounds the understanding and will and makes them the same. Whether they be the same or no, I will not now dispute, but only would observe that if it be so, and the Arminian notion of liberty consists in a self-determining power in the understanding, free of all necessity, being independent, undetermined by anything prior to its own acts and determinations, and the more the understanding is thus independent and sovereign over its own determinations, the more free, then the freedom of the soul as a moral agent must consist in the independence of the understanding on any evidence or appearance of things, or anything whatsoever that stands forth to the view of the mind prior to the understanding's determination. And what a liberty is this, consisting in an ability, freedom, and easiness of judging, either according to evidence or against it, having a sovereign command over itself at all times, to judge either agreeably or disagreeably to what is plainly exhibited to its own view. Certainly it is no liberty that renders persons the proper subjects of persuasive reasoning, arguments, expostulations, and such like moral means and inducements, the use of which with mankind is a main argument of the Arminians, to defend their notion of liberty without all necessity. For according to this, the more free men are, the less they are under the government of such means, less subject to the power of evidence and reason, and more independent on their influence in their determinations. And whether the understanding and will are the same or no, as Dr. Clarke seems to suppose, yet in order to maintain the Arminian notion of liberty without necessity, the free will is not determined by the understanding, nor necessarily connected with the understanding, and the further from such connection, the greater the freedom. And when the liberty is full and complete, the determinations of the will have no connection at all with the dictates of the understanding. And if so, in vain are all the applications to the understanding, in order to induce to any free virtuous act. And so in vain are all instructions, counsels, invitations, expostulations, and all arguments and persuasives whatsoever. For these are but applications to the understanding, and a clear and lively exhibition of the objects of choice to the mind's view. But if, after all, the will must be self-determined and independent on the understanding, to what purpose are things thus represented to the understanding in order to determine the choice? Volition necessarily connected with the influence of motives, with particular observations on the great inconsistence of Mr. Chubb's assertions and reasonings about the freedom of the will. That every act of the will has some cause and consequently, by what has been already proved, has a necessary connection with its cause, and so is necessary by a necessity of connection and consequence, is evident by this, that every act of the will whatsoever is excited by some motive, which is manifest because if the mind, in willing after the manner it does, is excited by no motive or inducement, then it has no end which it proposes to itself or pursues in so doing. It aims at nothing and seeks nothing. And if it seeks nothing, then it does not go after anything or exert any inclination or preference towards anything, which brings the matter to a contradiction, because for the mind to will something, and for it to go after something by an act of preference and inclination, are the same thing. But if every act of the will is excited by a motive, then that motive is the cause of the act. If the acts of the will are excited by motives, then motives are the causes of their being excited, or, which is the same thing, the cause of their existence. And if so, the existence of the acts of the will is properly the effect of their motives. Motives do nothing as motives or inducements, but by their influence, and so much as is done by their influence is the effect of them. For that is the notion of an effect, something that is brought to pass by the influence of something else. And if volitions are properly the effects of their motives, then they are necessarily connected with their motives. Every effect and event being, as was proved before, necessarily connected with that which is the proper ground and reason of its existence. Thus it is manifest that volition is necessary, and is not from any self-determining power in the will. The volition, which is caused by previous motive and inducement, is not caused by the will exercising a sovereign power over itself, to determine, cause, and excite volitions in itself. This is not consistent with the will acting in a state of indifference and equilibrium to determine itself to a preference, for the way in which motives operate is by biasing the will and giving it a certain inclination or preponderation one way. Here it may be proper to observe that Mr. Chubb, in his collection of tracts on various subjects, has advanced a scheme of liberty which is greatly divided against itself and thoroughly subversive of itself, and that many ways. 1. He is abundant in asserting that the will in all its acts is influenced by motive and excitement, and that this is the previous ground and reason of all its acts, and that it is never otherwise in any instance. He says, page 262, no action can take place without some motive to excite it, and, page 263, volition cannot take place without some previous reason or motive to induce it, and, page 310, action would not take place without some reason or motive to induce it, it being absurd to suppose that the active faculty would be exerted without some previous reason to dispose the mind to action. So also, page 257. And he speaks of these things as what we may be absolutely certain of, and which are the foundation, the only foundation we have of certainty respecting God's moral perfections. Pages 252 through 255, and 261 through 264. And yet, at the same time, by his scheme, the influence of motives upon us to excite to action, and to be actually a ground of volition, is consequent on the volition or choice of the mind. For he very greatly insists upon it that in all free actions, before the mind is the subject of those volitions, which motives excite, it chooses to be so. It chooses whether it will comply with the motive which presents itself in view or not, and when various motives are presented, it chooses which it will yield to and which it will reject. Page 256. Every man has power to act or to refrain from acting agreeably with or contrary to any motive that presents. Page 257. Every man is at liberty to act or refrain from acting agreeably with or contrary to what each of these motives, considered singly, would excite him to. Man has power, and is as much at liberty to reject the motive that does prevail, as he has power, and is at liberty to reject those motives that do not. And so, page 310, 311. In order to constitute a moral agent, it is necessary that he should have power to act or to refrain from acting upon such moral motives as he pleases, and to the like purpose in many other places. According to these things, the will acts first and chooses or refuses to comply with the motive that is presented before it falls under its prevailing influence, and it is first determined by the mind's pleasure or choice what motives it will be induced by before it is induced by them. Now, how can these things hang together? How can the mind first act, and by its act of volition and choice, determine what motives shall be the ground and reason of its volition and choice? For this supposes the choice is already made before the motive has its effect, and that the volition is already exerted before the motive prevails, so as actually to be the ground of the volition, and make the prevailing of the motive the consequence of the volition, of which yet it is the ground. If the mind has already chosen to comply with a motive and to yield to its excitement, the excitement comes in too late and is needless afterwards. If the mind has already chosen to yield to a motive which invites to a thing, that implies, and in fact is, a choosing of the thing incited to, and the very act of choice is before the influence of the motive which induces and is the ground of the choice. The Son is beforehand with the Father that begets him. The choice is supposed to be the ground of that influence of the motive, which very influence is supposed to be the ground of the choice, and so vice versa. The choice is supposed to be the consequence of the influence of the motive, which influence of the motive is the consequence of that very choice. And besides, if the will acts first towards the motive before it falls under its influence, and the prevailing of the motive upon it to induce it to act and choose be the fruit and consequence of its act and choice, then how is the motive a previous ground and reason of the act and choice, so that in the nature of the things, volition cannot take place without some previous reason and motive to induce it, and that this act is consequent upon and follows the motive, which things Mr. Chubb often asserts as of certain and undoubted truth. so that the very same motive is both previous and consequent, both before and after, both the ground and fruit of the very same thing. 2. Agreeable to the aforementioned inconsistent notion of the will first acting towards the motive, choosing whether it will comply with it, in order to it becoming a ground of the will's acting before any act of volition can take place, Mr. Chubb frequently calls motives and excitements to the action of the will the passive ground or reason of that action, which is a remarkable phrase, than which I presume there is none more unintelligible, and void of distinct and consistent meaning in all the writings of Duns Scotus or Thomas Aquinas. When he represents the motive volition as passive, he must mean passive in that affair, or passive with respect to that action which he speaks of. Otherwise, it is nothing to the design of his argument. He must mean, if that can be called a meaning, that the motive to volition is first acted upon or towards by the volition, choosing to yield to it, making it a ground of action, or determining to fetch its influence from thence, and so to make it a previous ground of its own excitation and existence, which is the same absurdity as if one should say that the soul of man, previous to its existence, chose by what cause it would come into existence, and acted upon its cause to fetch influence thence to bring it into being, and so its cause was a passive ground of its existence. Mr. Chubb very plainly supposes motive or excitement to be the ground of the being of volition. He speaks of it as the ground or reason of the exertion of an act of the will, pages 391 and 392, and expressly says that volition cannot take place without some previous ground or motive to induce it, page 363. And he speaks of the act as from the motive and from the influence of the motive, page 352, and from the influence that the motive has on the man for the production of an action, page 317. Certainly there is no need of multiplying words about this. It is easily judged whether motive can be the ground of volition taking place, so that the very production of it is from the influence of the motive, and yet the motive, before it becomes the ground of the volition, is passive or acted upon the volition. But this I will say, that a man who insists so much on clearness of meaning in others, and is so much in blaming their confusion and inconsistence, ought, if he was able, to have explained his meaning in this phrase of passive ground of action, so as to show it not to be confused and inconsistent. If any should suppose that Mr. Chubb, when he speaks of motive as a passive ground of action, does not mean passive with regard to that volition which is the ground of, but some other antecedent volition, though his purpose and argument and whole discourse will by no means allow of such a supposition, yet it would not help the matter in the least, for 1. If we suppose an act by which the soul chooses to yield to the invitation of a motive to another volition, both these supposed volitions are in effect the very same. A volition to yield to the force of a motive inviting to choose something comes to just the same thing as choosing the thing which the motive invites to, as I observed before. So that here can be no room to help the matter by a distinction of two volitions. 2. If the motive be passive not with respect to the same volition to which the motive excites, but to one truly distinct and prior, yet by Mr. Chubb that prior volition cannot take place without a motive or excitement as a previous ground of its existence. For he insists that it is absurd to suppose any volition should take place without some previous motive to induce it, so that at last it comes to just the same absurdity. For if every volition must have a previous motive, then the very first in the whole series must be excited by a previous motive, and yet the motive to that first volition is passive, but cannot be passive with regard to another antecedent volition because, by the supposition, it is the very first. Therefore, if it be passive with respect to any volition, it must be so with regard to that very volition of which it is the ground and that is excited by it. 3. Though Mr. Chubb asserts as above that every volition has some motive and that, in the nature of the thing, no volition can take place without some motive to induce it, yet he asserts that volition does not always follow the strongest motive, or, in other words, is not governed by any superior strength of the motive that is followed, beyond motives to the contrary, previous to the volition itself. His own words, page 258, are as follow. Though with regard to physical causes that which is strongest always prevails, yet it is otherwise with regard to moral causes. Of these, sometimes the stronger, sometimes the weaker prevails, and the ground of this difference is evident, namely, that what we call moral causes, strictly speaking, are no causes at all, but barely passive reasons of or excitements to the action, or to the refraining from acting, which excitements we have power, or are at liberty, to comply with or reject, as I have showed above. And so, throughout the paragraph, he, in a variety of phrases, insists that the will is not always determined by the strongest motive, unless by strongest we preposterously mean actually prevailing in the event, which is not in the motive, but in the will, but that the will is not always determined by the motive which is strongest, by any strength previous to the volition itself. And he elsewhere abundantly asserts that the will is determined by no superior strength or advantage that motives have from any constitution or state of things, or any circumstances whatsoever, previous to the actual determination of the will. And indeed his whole discourse on human liberty implies it, his whole scheme is founded upon it. But these things cannot stand together. There is a diversity of strength in motives to choice, previous to the choice itself. Mr. Chubb himself supposes that they do previously invite, induce, excite, and dispose the mind to action. This implies that they have something in themselves that is inviting, some tendency to induce and dispose to volition previous to volition itself. And if they have in themselves this nature and tendency, doubtless they have it in certain limited degrees, which are capable of diversity, and some have it in greater degrees, others in less. And they that have most of this tendency, considered with all their nature and circumstances, previous to volition, are the strongest motives, and those that have least are the weakest motives. Now, if volition sometimes does not follow the motive which is strongest, or has most previous tendency or advantage, all things considered, to induce or excite it, but follows the weakest or that which, as it stands previously in the mind's view, has least tendency to induce it, herein the will apparently acts wholly without motive, without any previous reason to dispose the mind to it, contrary to what the same author supposes. The act wherein the will must proceed without a previous motive to induce it is the act of preferring the weakest motive. For how absurd it is to say the mind sees previous reason in the motive, to prefer that motive before the other, and at the same time to suppose that there is nothing in the motive, in its nature, state, or any circumstance of it whatsoever, as it stands in the previous view of the mind, that gives it any preference. But on the contrary, the other motive that stands in competition with it, in all these respects, has most belonging to it that is inviting and moving, and has most of a tendency to choice and preference. This is certainly as much as to say, there is previous ground and reason in the motive for the act of preference, and yet no previous reason for it, by the supposition as to all that is in the two rival motives, which tends to preference, previous to the act of preference. It is not in that which is preferred, but wholly in the other. And yet Mr. Chubb supposes that the act of preference is from previous ground and reason in the motive which is preferred. But are these things consistent? Can there be previous ground in a thing for an event that takes place, and yet no previous tendency in it to that event? If one thing follows another without any previous tendency to its following, then I should think it very plain that it follows it without any manner of previous reason why it should follow. Yea, in this case Mr. Chubb supposes that the event follows an antecedent as the ground of its existence, which has not only no tendency to it, but a contrary tendency. The event is the preference which the mind gives to that motive which is weaker as it stands in the previous view of the mind. The immediate antecedent is the view the mind has of the two rival motives conjunctly, in which previous view of the mind all the preferableness or previous tendency to preference is supposed to be on the other side, or in the contrary motive, and all the unworthiness of preference, and so previous tendency to comparative neglect or undervaluing, is on that side which is preferred. And yet in this view of the mind is supposed to be the previous ground or reason of this act of preference, exciting it and disposing the mind to it, which I leave the reader to judge whether it be absurd or not. If it be not, then it is not absurd to say that the previous tendency of an antecedent to a consequent is the ground and reason why that consequent does not follow, and the want of a previous tendency to an event, yea, a tendency to the contrary, is the true ground and reason why that event does follow. An act of choice or preference is a comparative act, wherein the mind acts with reference to two or more things that are compared, and stand in competition in the mind's view. If the mind in this comparative act prefers that which appears inferior in the comparison, then the mind herein acts absolutely without motive or inducement, or any temptation whatsoever. Then, if a hungry man has the offer of two sorts of food, to both which he finds an appetite, but has a stronger appetite to one than the other, and there be no circumstances or excitements whatsoever in the case to induce him to take either the one or the other, but merely his appetite, if, in the choice he makes between them, he chooses that which he has least appetite to, and refuse to that which he has the strongest appetite, this is a choice made absolutely without previous motive, excitement, reason, or temptation, as much as if he were perfectly without all appetite to either, because his volition in this case is a comparative act, following a comparative view of the food which he chooses, in which view his preference has absolutely no previous ground, yea, is against all previous ground in motive. And if there be any principle in man, from whence an active choice may arise after this manner, from the same principle volition may arise wholly without motive on either side. If the mind in its volition can go beyond motive, then it can go without motive, for when it is beyond the motive, it is out of the reach of the motive, out of the limits of its influence, and so without motive. If so, this demonstrates the independence of volition on motive, and no reason can be given for what Mr. Chubb so often asserts, even that, in the nature of things, volition cannot take place without a motive to induce it. If the Most High should endow a balance with agency or activity of nature, in such a manner that when unequaled weights are put into the scales, its agency could enable it to cause that scale to descend which has the least weight, and so to raise the greater weight, this would clearly demonstrate that the motion of the balance does not depend on weights in the scales, at least as much as if the balance should move itself when there is no weight in either scale, and the activity of the balance which is sufficient to move itself against the greater weight must certainly be more than sufficient to move it when there is no weight at all. Mr. Chubb supposes that the will cannot stir at all without some motive, and also supposes that if there be a motive to one thing and none to the contrary, volition will infallibly follow that motive. This is virtually to suppose an entire dependence of the will on motives. If it were not wholly dependent on them, it could surely help itself a little without them, or help itself a little against a motive, without help from the strength and weight of a contrary motive. And yet his supposing that the will, when it has before it various opposite motives, can use them as it pleases, and choose its own influence from them, and neglect the strongest and follow the weakest, supposes it to be wholly independent on motives. It further appears, on Mr. Chubb's hypothesis, that volition must be without any previous ground in any motive. Thus, if it be, as he supposes, that the will is not determined by any previous superior strength of the motive, but determines and chooses its own motive, then, when the rival motives are exactly equal in all respects, it may follow either, and may, in such a case, sometimes follow one, sometimes the other. And if so, this diversity which appears between the acts of the will is plainly without previous ground in either of the motives, for all that is previously in the motives is supposed precisely and perfectly the same, without any diversity whatsoever.